All right, well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I'm John Wetenkamp, Service Hydrologist here at the National Weather Service office in La Crosse. And this evening, we will be using the Poll Everywhere question polling software here if you'd like to participate in a few questions that we'll be covering here this evening on the Weather Explorer series covering flash flooding. And if you have any questions during the webinar, I'll get to those as time allows, and then also we will open it up for questions here at the end of the webinar if you have any additional questions that you'd like to ask. We have a map here showing the registrants for tonight's talk. So welcome everyone here from Wisconsin and portions of Minnesota and Iowa. Thank you for joining us here this evening. And we created this map earlier today, so if anyone is signed up a little bit later, welcome to you as well. Okay, so we'll start off with defining a flash flood. Well, what is a flash flood? Well, first off, I just want to put this right up front. It is the #1 weather-related killer in the United States. Not to be underestimated. Essentially, is like the name implies, it's a rapid onset of flooding. It's a flash flood. It happens quickly. It's often produced from heavy rainfall, especially in our region during thunderstorm season. Also, during the warm season, we call it as meteorologists. It can also be produced from a dam or levee failure, and also ice jams. We're no stranger to those either in this part of the region, where we experience cold temperatures leading to ice formation on rivers, and also we can have deep snowpack that can melt rapidly and break up that ice and cause problems, in addition to rainfall on top of frozen soils. So many different ways you can kind of create ice jam floods. Also, heavy rain on wildfire burn scars. We don't really have any issues with that locally. Not to say that couldn't happen in the Coulee region where we have some steeper hills, but that's mainly a concern out west where we have complex terrain, mountain areas that experience intense fires, especially in coniferous forests, where those intense fires can impact the local soils and also lead to buildup of debris following the burn and cause additional issues. So we'll talk a little bit about that tonight as well. And by definition, it's a flooding onset time of less than 6 hours. However, it typically occurs much faster than that, more on the time scale of maybe an hour, if that, depending on how intense the rainfall is and how steep the local terrain is. So what is a flash flood here? Continued. It's a life-threatening situation, and it's often associated with a known river or body of water, but not always. It can also occur where there are no existing streams, dry creek beds, steep valleys, or ravines. In the Coulee region here, just kind of think about maybe areas that maybe you like to recreate, or maybe you live near the bottom of a coulee near a drainage area that doesn't typically see water or much water. Flash flooding can develop in those as well. Those are drainages. You just need a lot of water in those areas to produce flash flooding or heavy rainfall or deep snowpack melting rapidly. Flash floods, there's different types of floods, and flash floods are the most dangerous. And that's due to the combination of the destructive power of the floodwaters and then the incredible speed of the floodwaters. So some factors that contribute to flash flooding. One of the leading causes are heavy, intense rainfall. And typically these are high rainfall rate type of events. You get a lot of rainfall falling in a short amount of time. It can be 1 to 2 inches per hour. So when we have these high rainfall rates, there's less time for the rainfall to infiltrate into the ground. So a lot of that runs off. And factors that influence the infiltration into the ground can be soil types. Is it wet soil versus dry soil? Has there been recent rainfall events that have created wet soil conditions? Also, soil types. Do you live in an area that has more clay than sand? Clay soils tend to be more conducive for runoff than sandy soils, which will infiltrate much of that water or much of the rainfall. And also runoff. How quickly does the rainfall run off of the land surface? If you think of a frozen ground surface, nothing's going to really infiltrate into the ground. It's just going to all run off. And also how quickly rainfall runs off is influenced by terrain. So kind of a worst case, if you're in rocky terrain that's very steep, you're going to experience very rapid runoff in those areas. And I'll just pause there for a minute. We had one question here that I see that popped up. Where's the link for Poll Everywhere? I will include that when I ask the first question and the instructions how to log into that. We'll be showing, and I'll give everyone a minute to get logged into that. So thank you for that question, and we'll be getting there just very shortly. The ground must be saturated for flash flooding to occur. The ground doesn't have to be saturated for flash flooding to occur. It's really about the rainfall rates, and that tends to be the main driver for flash flooding events. And with that in mind, kind of talking about infiltration rates and rainfall rates, we'll cover urban flash flooding here first. So for those of you that live in more densely populated or urban areas, certainly you're no stranger to runoff on city streets or on parking areas that you experience during heavy rainfall. And what's contributing to that is construction of buildings, roads, parking lots, and driveways. That's really all increasing the runoff. And what that does is it reduces the amount of rain absorbed by the ground. And in addition to that, it can reroute natural drainage areas. And many communities have put in mitigation structures to help with these issues, but there are some areas that they just tend to have problems when it rains heavily. And depending on local factors in urban areas, just as a general rule, about 1 inch of rainfall in 1 hour is enough to produce flooding concerns in urbanized areas. Also, dam and levee failures. Flooding can develop quickly following a dam or levee failure. So it's important to know where you live according to where these structures are. If you're close to a dam or levee, kind of know your risk. Know if you're in the path of potential flooding if in the event of a failure. Or maybe you work in an area like that. And just know what you need to do to seek higher ground in the event that one of these structures would fail and you'd experience rapid flooding from this type of a structure failure. Now, it's not common, but it does happen. And ice jams, as I alluded to a little earlier, rapid flooding can result when large ice jams form suddenly or they release suddenly. The picture here on the right is an example of an ice jam. I believe this one was from Pennsylvania, not necessarily a local example here, but I thought it really showed nicely here the large chunks of ice that were displaced and pushed into homes, into yards. And this type of flooding usually occurs after you have abnormally cold temperatures, and then followed by warm temperatures or rapid snowmelt, or as a worst case scenario, you have rapid snowmelt and heavy rainfall. And if you still have thick ice cover in place on area rivers, that ice can get jammed up on sharp river bends, bridges. It could be multiple ways that ice can become hung up, if you will. And the one kind of silver lining in trying to predict these is that they tend to happen in the same areas year after year. There's actually our partners at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers that keep a database of where these ice jams have occurred, and there you can kind of you keep that database and you can kind of get an idea of where the ice jam may be forming or is likely forming. So then, as meteorologists and hydrologists, we can send observers to go in and check for ice jams from a safe location and see if that's indeed what's happening. There aren't a lot of river gauges. There are many, but there's not river gauges everywhere that these ice jams occur. We can see them if the ice jam forms in the right location near a gauge. We can kind of suspect it's happening, or kind of see the hydrograph trace and say, yep, that's what we know to be an ice jam. Otherwise, we rely on spotters or observers going out and informing us where the ice jam's forming, and then from there we can issue a watch or warning or a statement alerting residents near the river or to those that could be impacted by high water levels or large chunks of ice that could be displaced by an ice jam. Wildfire burn scars. Now, what can happen following an intense wildfire, the soils can actually become hydrophobic. And what that means is they will not absorb water, or pretty much will repel the water following a wildfire. So any rain that falls on those burn scars just runs off, almost like as if it was a frozen soil. However, often following a wildfire, there can be a lot of debris, trees that have been uprooted, pushed over, burned logs, also just whatever was burned on the surface, or burned the vegetation that was kind of helping hold soils in place. That can become a debris flow off of the burn area and create an even more dangerous situation. And here's an example of that on this picture, right next to a stream, but the debris essentially was flowing off of the hillside during a heavy rainfall event. And that's another type of threat that can result from flash flooding. Think of it as a type of flash flooding. And this is typically observed in steeper terrain, especially in the western United States. So I just want to talk a little bit about flash flood warnings kind of in the last 10 years across the United States. And what I'm showing here on this map is the number of flash flood warnings based on the local weather service forecast office. So each of these outlines that you see here are a forecast, what we call a forecast area for National Weather Service offices. Ours, you can see here, the La Crosse forecast area here, right here in southwest Wisconsin, southeast Minnesota, and northeast Iowa. That's the La Crosse forecast area, if you're not familiar with it. In the last 10 years, we have issued 267 flash flood warnings. Now, that's a fairly high amount if you look at the Great Lakes region in portions of the upper Mississippi River Valley. But if you look further to the south in the lower Mississippi River Valley, there's some forecast offices that have issued over 1,000 flash flood warnings in the past 10 years. And the same case in the south portions of the Southwest, where they have flashy river basins and areas that are prone to flash flooding. They have also issued over 1,000 flash flood warnings in the last 10 years. So how about flash flood reports over the last 10 years by National Weather Service office across the United States? So these are the storm reports that the local National Weather Service office sends out, and we would classify it as a flash flood. So for our local area, we've issued 553 flash flood reports in the past 10 years. And now again, that's a pretty healthy number compared to other offices in the upper Midwest and Great Lakes region and upper Mississippi River Valley. However, you look further east, and you can see that there's some offices that have issued over 1,000. Same case as we get into the lower Mississippi River Valley, and again, portions of the Southwest. So you can kind of see where these areas that are more prone to flash flooding are, and the Weather Service offices that cover those areas. And then there's some pretty quiet areas too, that, such as in the Northwest, where they don't have, not to say that they haven't had flooding events, just they haven't had what would be classified as a flash flooding event. very few numbers anyway, in the single digits in some cases, certainly less than 100 for most of those areas. So let's move ahead and talk about flash flood safety. So one of the leading causes of flood fatalities, unfortunately, is people driving into floodwaters. And I won't get into too many details on those statistics. We will have a future Weather Explorer Series webinar that'll focus on flash flood fatalities or flooding fatalities across the U.S. So here's an example of an individual that drove into floodwaters and had to climb to the top of their vehicle and wait to be rescued. So that's why we message this in our warnings. We tell people when the road's flooded, turn around, don't drown, don't drive into floodwaters. It's unfortunate, but this just keeps happening year after year, and there are many communities that are looking at ways to try to mitigate folks doing this. There's the outreach component, making people aware of it, and then sometimes it's just hard to stop people. So you literally have to take steps to stop them from doing this. So more of that will be covered in a future Weather Explorer Series webinar. So one of the biggest things for flash flood safety is really know your risk. Do you live in a flood risk area? Are you in a low-lying area that's prone to flash flooding, or maybe you moved into a new area? Or do you know that if there's a flood risk for your location? One thing that we see almost on a yearly basis across the National Weather Service offices are those recreating in flood risk areas, such as campers or folks that are out canoeing or kayaking or hiking. They may be camping out near a flash flood prone stream, and maybe they're not familiar with the area and the risk, and there may not even be thunderstorms impacting them locally, but yet they could still be under risk for flash flooding. So it's really important. Maybe you're heading out, checking out for the weekend, so to speak. Stay weather aware, especially if you're camping in a lower spot in a drainage area. I mean, in addition to this time of year with heat and severe thunderstorm threats, be aware of the flash flood risk as well, and know if you're potentially under risk for that. And have a plan and keep up on the latest weather information. If flooding does develop in your area, what do you do? Do you have a way to receive weather alerts? Smartphone is one of the main ways to kind of keep up with the latest weather information these days. But in some of these rural areas, you don't have cell phone coverage. Maybe consider purchasing a NOAA weather radio. Some of these more rural areas and low spots, maybe the reception's a little questionable too in spots. So just have a way to maintain contact with someone or know what's happening in the weather world if you're in a potential risky area for flooding. And monitor river levels closely. If you're near a riverway or near a stream or an area prone to flash flooding, and have a plan to move to higher ground if flooding is possible. And it's important to know the difference between a flood warning and a flood watch. Do you know the difference between the two? A flood warning is issued when flooding is happening or it's expected to happen soon. Some roads will be flooded. In some cases, some roads will be washed out completely, water flowing over them. Maybe if you wait until there's a flood warning issued, you may not be able to evacuate in time, especially if you're in a real flood-prone area. When the flood warning is issued, that means that's time to take action, move to higher ground, and never drive through floodwaters, like we already talked about. Time and time again, people driving into floodwaters, don't do that. Turn around, don't drown. Now, a flood watch is issued when flooding is possible. It's not a certainty. So that's kind of the be prepared stage. Stay tuned to radio or TV, or follow your local National Weather Service office's webpage, and be ready to move to higher ground if a warning is issued. All right, so it looks like Poll Everywhere is cooperating this time around. That's good. So If you are on a computer, try this again. There we go. Looks like our responses are working this time. You can log in at couleev.com or on your smartphone, text NWS LSC 356 to 22333. So you are not under a risk for flash flooding if it isn't raining at your location. True A or false B? Give everyone a minute or two here to answer that question. All right. Give everyone a few more seconds here. All right. Looks like everyone went with B, false. Outstanding. That's right, false. Heavy rain can be occurring far away from your location, and you can still be impacted by floodwaters. You see classic examples of this out west, where it may be raining over, and here for that matter, where it may be raining over the headwaters of a river. If you think about maybe a mountain range, maybe you're going camping out more in a desert area, but there's heavy rains occurring over a mountain range that's in the distance. And those floodwaters can flow away from those mountain ranges and produce flash flooding well away from the actual thunderstorm or heavy rainfall. Very good. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the NWS impact-based flash flood warnings, if you're not familiar with those. The National Weather Service has three categories of flash flood warnings, if you will. And we use tags. We use a tagging, so we call it, to specify the flash flood threat. And the flooding severity goes from low to high. So the base flash flood warning is a lower severity flood warning. It's still potentially life-threatening. So you can think of that as, you can find trouble. If you go out and you're driving around during a flash flood warning, there could be a road washed out. There could be water flowing over a road. You could encounter issues if you're not careful. So in those cases, less widespread impacts, it's isolated to more vulnerable locations, areas that typically flood during heavy rainfall. And, those are the spots where, steps need to be taken for immediate protection of life and property. And what's new this year is the wireless emergency alerts on your smartphones will not be activated, or on your cell phones will not be activated for the base flash flood warning if we don't use a higher threat level or a tag of a higher threat level. So the next step with increasing severity here is using the considerable tag or considerable flash flood warning. Now we're talking an increasing threat, and you can kind of think of this as trouble will find you. Maybe you're in a spot that typically doesn't flood, but it could during extreme rainfall or very heavy rainfall. You're starting to see more widespread or unusual impacts. Normal decisions could put you at risk. Maybe say, well, I just need to drive to work today. Typically during heavy rains, this isn't a problem, but on this particular day, the stream that only floods maybe once every 2 or 5 years, now this might be a day that's happening. Could be a problem for you if you're trying to get somewhere. In this particular tag for the flood warning will trigger the wireless emergency alert system. So you would be notified on your phone if your phone is enabled for that capability, you're in an area that has reception to receive that. And this could be heavy rain in urban areas as well. Maybe we're getting into dam and levee failure, somewhat of a more moderate risk or maybe lower risk dam or levee failure. But it is going to impact especially vulnerable spots, the heavy rainfall. So if we take it a step higher and use the catastrophic tag, this is a very high impact, extreme flash flooding event. This is what we call the flash flood emergency. It's rare, very rare that these are issued, but unfortunately it has happened in our area already where we've had some flash flood emergencies in portions of northeast Iowa and southwest Wisconsin. And this is, you can think of it as trouble is here and it's bad. You may think you're safe from flooding where you're at, but in this extreme catastrophic situation, you're not. You're seeing widespread severe impacts, water likely where you've never seen it before. It's immediate protection of life and property is critical in all locations. There may be folks that need to be rescued from the water. Swift water rescues may be needed for whatever reasons, but flooding is the highest level flooding that you could ever experience, and hopefully you never have to. There could be numerous evacuations going on, and maybe this is a case where there was a high-risk dam or a levee failure. It's going to flood a community. It's going to flood a residential area. This is an extremely dangerous and life-threatening situation. And these, of course, will alert your cellular phone. These will trigger the wireless emergency alerts. So I want everyone to just kind of take a minute and think about any other. We talked a lot about some water causing kind of the main risk or main hazard. We talked about debris flows from wildfire burn scars, dam and levee failures. But can you think of any other flash flood hazards other than just the dangers of floodwaters? Now, you don't have to submit these. I don't have a pull everywhere question for this, but I'll just give everyone a few seconds here to think about any other hazards that you could encounter in from floodwaters or during a flash flooding situation. All right. Go ahead and reveal my answer. Rock slides and mudslides can also be deadly during heavy rains in steeper terrain areas. And unfortunately, we experienced this in the Coulee region. This picture here was an example of the 2007 extreme flooding that the region experienced. This was a mudslide near Brownsville, Minnesota, and you can see what it did to that old international dump truck. And there's been cases where homes have been destroyed and roads completely covered from rocks and mudslides. So very significant, very dangerous situation in steeper terrain areas. So something else to keep in mind if you live in an area has experienced these, or maybe you've seen these, or you know that there's an unstable area nearby, just something to keep in mind. So now I'm going to move ahead to examples of serious and some local flash flooding events, and we saw in just the previous example that I showed here what resulted from the historic rainfall flooding of August 18th and 20th, 2007. During this extreme rainfall and flooding event, rainfall amounts over the period of August 18th and 19th ranged from around 6 inches to over 15 inches of rainfall, which is unbelievable. The impacts from this extreme of a rainfall, we saw rocks and mudslides, numerous bridges washed out, roads washed out, and unfortunately, due to this extreme flooding, there were 7 fatalities. A 24-hour Minnesota rainfall record was set in Hoka, Minnesota, 15.1 inches of rain. Unbelievable. And this was the result of training thunderstorms hour after hour along a stalled frontal boundary. We saw rainfall rates of 1 to 2 inches per hour. And these are some of these nights. I've lived here for a while. I've experienced some of these extreme flooding events. And these are the nights where I call it strobe lightning. Thunderstorms are just occurring all night long. It's just raining heavily over an area over and over and over. Those are the situations that can become very dangerous, especially overnight. And then wake up in the morning. Maybe the rain's ended, maybe it hasn't. But people are trying to get to where they need to go, and when there's this much damage to infrastructure, it can be a very dangerous situation, even after the rain has ended. More recently, we had record-breaking flooding and really a life-threatening flash flooding event here on August 27th, that night, 2018, and we had additional rainfall going into the 28th. And this was a situation where we did issue a flash flood emergency the night of the heavy rainfall. The map on the left here shows a 2-day radar estimated rainfall. A lot of that fell in one night. A rainfall of 8 to 12 inches across portions of southeast Minnesota, just clipped far northeast Iowa, but much of that rain fell in southwest and into portions of south central Wisconsin. And here on the right is a radar loop of that evening and when some of the most intense rainfall was occurring and life-threatening flash flooding was experienced. So you can see we're going at 10-minute increments here on the radar loop. So the initial line of thunderstorms goes through that evening, which we did experience other severe weather threats as well with that line of storms. And then later on that night, that's when the training thunderstorms developed. Boundary set up from that first line of thunderstorms, and the atmospheric conditions were favorable for very heavy rainfall, and the forcing in the atmosphere was present to interact with that boundary, and it started to rain along that boundary, and it just continued through much of the overnight hours and produced just unbelievable record-setting amounts of rain and extreme flooding impacts. So here are some photos, kind of the aftermath following the heavy rain. The community of Ontario was devastated. Record flood pressed there on the Kickapoo River. The upper center picture there is Jersey Valley, the Jersey Valley Reservoir or dam, if you're familiar with that in Vernon County. They experienced a spillway washout and some extreme flooding downstream from that structure. Also, numerous highways and bridges were washed out. And much of the Kickapoo Valley was experienced just a devastating flood from this event and record setting. And I'll show some press here from that shortly. Here are the August 27th and 28th, 2018 rainfall totals. They're broken down here by per 24 hours. So 7 a.m. Monday to 7 a.m. Tuesday, the most rainfall that was measured during that period was in the Cashton area, 10.52 inches of rain. And then over the next 24 hours, another 2 inches of rain fell, 2.14 inches of rain, bringing them a 2-day total of 12.66. So over the course of 2 days, we saw rainfall in that area that was highlighted here earlier, anywhere from around 4 inches to nearly 13 inches of rainfall. So this established, unfortunately, a lot of this drained into the Kickapoo Basin, as well as the Little Crosse and Coon Creek drainages, and many other drainages were impacted by this as well, or watersheds. New record crests were established on the Kickapoo River. Ontario saw a new crest of 28 feet.52. That broke the previous record of 21.96 set back in 2008. And it's pretty much the same story here all the way down the Kickapoo River Basin. Lafarge set a new record, Viola, Reedstown, Soldiers Grove, Gaze Mills, and Steuben. So they all set record crests following that extreme rainfall event. So I'm going to get into forecasting flash floods. Well, how do we do that at the National Weather Service office? What do forecasters look at to try to forecast these extreme rainfall events or really any flash flooding? Well, we do look at computer model data. We look at what we call mesoscale or very small scale computer models. And what I mean by small scale is they can resolve very small scale features in the atmosphere. They're very complex models, but they can resolve things as small as a thunderstorm. And in the modeling world, a thunderstorm is a pretty small scale event. Also, we use observations of weather and current hydrologic conditions. Again, that gets back into what's the runoff potential for the area. Also, weather pattern recognition to identify potential flood days. Is this a day where the atmosphere is very juicy, meaning very high moisture content in the atmosphere? Is this a day that's conducive for heavy rainfall? But the exact location of flash flooding can be very difficult to forecast. There are events where we have high confidence where it will occur, but often what will happen is it depends on where those boundaries will set up. So it'll depend on where does the thunderstorms track through the area, where do they start to train. So it can be very difficult to pinpoint where that will develop, especially if you think on a county to county scale and beyond 3 to 6 hours. So when we see these signals, we apply our expertise and we'll issue a flash flood watch covering a larger area. So this is your pre-warning, this is your be prepared stage. We issue the flash flood watch. And then we know the conditions are favorable and we do expect heavy rain to occur. So that would be time to prepare and monitor for potential flash flood warnings. So talking about model data and forecast challenges, here I just took a screenshot of these. This is 9 different models showing precipitation. So if you can see the state outlines on your screen, but what the green shading and to the blue and to the purple shading are precipitation amounts depicted by a model. And where the heavier rain is, those blue and purple shades, even going into the red shades, are where the model on this particular day was trying to resolve thunderstorm activities, those that could resolve thunderstorm activity. Anyway, without getting too much into the modeling side of it, you can just see the differences what each model's take is on where that heavy rainfall will occur. So that's the challenge as a forecaster is, is there one that's picking up on the situation or none of them picking up on the situation? There's days where you can't really put a lot of weight into the models if they're not resolving what you think is going to happen as a meteorologist. Those are the more challenging days. So it's not always a clear-cut situation where the heaviest rain is going to occur for the day. So flash flood warning tools. Now, what do we use to issue flash flood warnings? And what kind of data do we review? And I'm going to pause here just for 1 minute and catch up. I see another question came in. The question was, on August 28th, 2018, was that a catastrophic tag? Well, we were not using, it would have been, but at the time we were not using the impact-based flash flood warnings yet. But that was a flash flood emergency that we issued, and we were focusing on the Coon Creek drainage for the flash flood emergency, and then we had a larger flash flood warning out along that heavy rain axis. But yes, that was a situation that was a catastrophic flood, and now that we're using the impact-based flash flood warning paradigm here, that would be a catastrophic event. So for flash flood warning tools, we use radar data. I mean, that's very important, especially at night. I mean, it's great when we get flooding reports, but unfortunately, a lot of these flash flooding events in our local region occur overnight, and there just aren't observers out there to see what's happening. Law enforcement is really key, and emergency management to help us gauge what's happening on the ground during those overnight hours. You don't want to drive around and see what's going on out there and get out of bed and risk, driving around and running into trouble. So we're really relying heavily on radar data and then getting ground truth reports from our partners, such as local law enforcement and emergency management. And those are some of the main tools that we use for flood warning operations. We also have, there are automated rainfall. There are automated rain gauges that we have access to, and even some observers are up later at night and providing, when they can safely do so, providing those rainfall reports to us. Also, there's a tool that we use called FLASH, and that stands for Flooded Locations and Simulated Hydrographs. And that program really helps us narrow in on the basins that are most impacted and what level of impact we can expect based on the rainfall that the radar is observing. So those are some of the main tools that we use, and it is challenging during the overnight hours to get real-time reports. So then the next step, kind of putting all of that together with our forecast tools and warning tools, it's getting the word out. From there, we're sending out information via the web. We're sending it out over the emergency alert system when it comes to warnings. We're in contact with our local law enforcement, dispatch centers, emergency managers, other local partners that we work closely with as well, such as county highway departments. There's just so many out there. Sending that information out via weather radio, could be receiving it via wireless emergency alerts. We're sending out graphics on social media. The graphic on the upper left was an example of a graphic that we sent out on the night of the August 28th, 2018 flood event during our flash flood emergency. We knew that there was severe flooding already going on along Coon Creek. We knew that evacuations were underway, and really just trying to stress that this is a life-threatening situation, and it needs to be taken seriously. So that concludes the presentation here this evening. Thank you again for joining us. I would be happy to answer any questions. If you'd like additional information, you can see our homepage, weather.gov/lacrosse, or for flood safety specific items. I have a link here. I'm showing that web address here, weather.gov/safety/flood.